Okay, so we get a sense here of the devastation that came along with the Western Front here, no man's land, and the trench areas themselves, battlefields, became just sort of unrecognizable pieces of terrain and land. And this would have been, much later, likely into late 1917, where the battlefields were so destroyed entirely from artillery shell and many years of fighting that there was nothing here to even hold the ground intact. So in order to move around, men had to begin to lay what were called duck boards, and they looked just sort of like those wooden pallets or skids that you'd see in a grocery store, maybe. And they created walkways so that if you fell off of one of these things, there was a very likely chance that the mud would just suck you in, or you would fall into a crater uh, hole that would have been filled with water, and you quite possibly would have drowned. That became a real problem with horses. In fact, later in the war, that horses were ordered away from the front lines because the design of a horse here, those skinny legs and big heavy body, they would get stuck into the ground and they couldn't pull them out, and they had to euthanize them. So this is a way that the men tried to navigate through the tough conditions. Here we can see a duckboard sort of walkway, but the destruction, the terrain, it was massive. We have to remind ourselves that people lived here where this war was fought in the Western Front, and we're talking about hundreds of kilometers of territory that was absolutely destroyed, and not just destroyed in the moment, but there was a generational effect here, where you had contamination, toxins, and all sorts of debris that were leached into the soil, and many soldiers or many farmers' lives were lost as a result of this devastation. This is a great shot here. You can see that this would have been a forest prior to the war. Look at all these trees, right? And they're absolutely destroyed from artillery fire and machine gun fire. And the consequence of that, as you destroy the landscape, is you begin to get flooding, right? Swamps like this would have formed. But it's a sign of just how badly damaged the landscape was here in the Western Front. Another scene here, the dangers of trying to fight uphill. You can see trees here destroyed from artillery fire, and then we have an explosion naturally here as well. So it became very, very difficult to move at all. Even to move a few meters at a time would have been very challenging in some of the later stages of the war. And you can see trying to move equipment became even more challenging. The heavy equipment was getting stuck into the mud here, and it would take many men to just move a cannon a few meters if need be. Here we've got a scene. This would have been behind enemy lines after a battle of some sort, and you can see the wounded here being sort of gathered up here onto stretchers, waiting to be evacuated to field hospitals. You can see some of the damaged vehicles, etc., that would be piled up in behind. So they're kind of taking inventory here of what are the losses. If you notice here, these three guys walking arm in arm, and this guy here's got a little bandage over his face. This guy's not bandaged, but they've probably been blinded by gas of some sort. And we'll talk more about gas at a later date. Here's just another scene, it otherwise would be beautiful, right? This beautiful day here, sun sort of peeking through the clouds, and yet on the ground, the Western Front was it was a wasteland. Just more sort of common scenes, right? Of the ground here was quite literally littered with dead bodies. This is an interesting shot. We've got here what would have been, these guys were called the Stink Patrol. And, why are they, wearing these masks? Well, these, of course, are gas masks, and gas was used in this war, first by the Germans. We'll talk more about that when we get into the battle where it was used. But this was one of the ways that gas was unleashed. It was fired through shells, through artillery cannons, and it could be fired into no man's land, and the wind would sort of push it across the battlefield into men, or it could be fired directly into the trench position here. But these gas masks here became standard issue following their first use at the Second Battle of Ypres, which we'll talk about. Here we can see an individual, wearing some sort of eye protection here, trying to protect themselves from gas attack.